having very intimate relationships with all of them suggesting that I should go to Burgundy and go experience what this is like in its kind of origins. And what I learned in '03, which was a really hot vintage in Burgundy, not thought of as necessarily an outstanding one. This was well before all this was so expensive in Burgundy, and if you knew people, you got appointments, and it was great. But this story leading up till now it was in '03 that I saw whole cluster fermentation for the first time. And so everything that you're going to taste in front of you today, these are all wines of a style that's called whole cluster fermentation, which when I started doing this in '04, there was, it would be certain to say less than 1% of the wine in California was made this way. You probably could say it was less than 1/10% in California that was made this way. Ironically, at the same time, Brewer Clifton started doing the same thing. And although I had talked with Steve and Greg about actually planting vineyards for them in Santa Maria, we're all busy, and I never even got to understand until like years later that was their style as well, but not something that was done broadly. And the thoughts on whole cluster in California were that it really made a wine that was more stemmy and green, not in a pleasant way, more kind of green bean, bell pepper. And what I knew I had on my site in Santa Maria is where our ranch sits is on, the soils are, it's essentially silt that's blown in from the estuaries of the ocean and then been pushed up by the plate shift. So we're sitting at about 700 feet of elevation, looking over the valley floor on a cold, windswept escarpment that it's a very brittle environment there. It's not a place that's ever going to make very productive vineyards. And so we knew, when I say we, it was me, but it's always sounds a little less self-full to say we. But I knew that, all right, we're gonna have to figure out how to make really high quality stuff because we're not gonna make it up on volume. And so quickly, I started to realize these conditions in Santa Maria, the longest, coolest growing season in all of California. So we have bud break oftentimes in February, and we just finished picking the Pinot Noir. This is an exceptionally cool year, which we haven't had one like this for a long time. We just finished picking probably about 3 weeks ago. And so what the goal of any time you can take advantage of the natural resources that are there is to go, if I've got this, what can I do to best take advantage of this natural resource? And I started to realize what I had just seen in Burgundy in '03, the whole cluster houses that I had the privilege to go taste at were Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, or Domaine Dujac, two of the most premier names in the world of wine, and they were all whole cluster houses. And so as we saw the '03 vintage the next season, when I went back and were tasting samples, a lot of the '03s were really uncharacteristic of the wines that those folks had been making for decades, because the heat makes the grapes very ripe, makes them very dark and rich. And Pinot is not a wine that historically is meant to be dark and rich. It's meant to be elegant and nuanced and transparent, back to showing the site. And so I realized my vineyard had this very unique quality of, we'd get the canopy to a certain height and then it would just stop. It wasn't a super vigorous site where it just keep growing. And as we got close to harvest, the leaves on their own just want to start falling off, and that's a term called senescence. They start going to sleep, and the shoot would be totally lignified. Lignified would mean woody. So if I whip that thing, it's a stick. It's not going to flex because it's green. And even within the stems that hold on to the pedestal, the cluster of grapes, they were more woody and lignified. And so that's when I started going, all right, maybe there's an opportunity here to do this. And we began that, the 2004 vintage. And upon submitting those wines to critical review, we got very strong critical review for a period of time where that wasn't so easy to get or so forth. So that's what kind of charted the course. That's been, I guess, roughly 20 vintages ago now. And I want you guys to be drinking too, by the way. Please, this will be a lot more fun for you and me if you're trying to want. But what I really wanted to share that background is Wes and Nina both know, as is anybody who's worked with me in the past, I don't show up and show one wine. That's how the commercial business goes. Is here's the wine. This is the best vintage of the century because we just sold out of the last one, and it's always the best vintage of the century. And my goal was never to make these wines be about a singular, this is our best. It was really to mark the vintage with what the year gave us. And the goal is very different for me in that I want them to be a volume in this is what the year gave us, that in most years is going to be very different than whatever the next year is. The goal is not to make consistency. If you want consistency, there are hundreds of brands in California that can give you that. Or you can go buy a bottle of scotch, or there's a lot of things that we just know it's going to be the same no matter when we go pick it up. If we're at LaGuardia or if we're in dinner in Chicago, those wines are going to be the same. What I wanted to do differently from day one as a person who had a much bigger role in the wine industry, selling grapes to big wineries, is to show that is there a small group of people who would be interested if we actually did something that was truly artisanal, and that the goal wasn't trying to figure out how we create scores, but how we create a real window to look back on, and in this one specific place, planted and managed by the same people with the same winemaking philosophies, can we actually see what happened there that year? And that's a very singular look at the wine business that you won't find very many other places.